All right, everybody, here we go with the notes for Chapter 16, Production Programming and the Modern Format, taking a deep dive into the types of programming that are available on radio. Identifying and capturing an audience is the heart and soul of on-air and off-air production. We've talked about those two main questions that you ask when you're in any form of communication. What is your message? Who is your audience? And thinking about those questions helps you to be able to formulate the way that you present your content over the air, because you want to reach the audience where it is at. You want to reach them from their point of view. You want to present content that is going to appeal to the audience. So number one, you have to identify the audience. Who are they? What are their likes? What are their dislikes? What's their beliefs, attitudes, and values? And then once you feel like you have a sense of who the audience is, what they're all about, then you come up with a strategy to capture that audience, to get their attention, to attract them to you and the things that you have to offer. Radio has become a medium designed to reach certain audiences to the exclusion of others. A large, ill-defined audience is not a particularly attractive commodity for an advertiser who might be selling a certain product or service to certain types of people. Just because you have a lot of earlobes listening to your station doesn't necessarily mean that they're the right earlobes, or that you have enough of the right earlobes. Something that is popular may be popular to many people, but the actual people that you want to reach may not care about what's popular. So if you have a product or service that you're trying to advertise to a certain group of people that tends to not follow the trends and do what everybody else is doing and that sort of thing, that means that no matter how many people are listening to a station, that message is going to be ineffective for the advertiser trying to reach the certain people that they want to. Now, again, this isn't to say that size is unimportant. Once you have a clearly defined audience, well, then the bigger audience that you have, the better that it will be. So keep that in mind as well. You want to attract as many people as you possibly can that fit a certain type of category, a certain type of, for lack of a better word, stereotype. As many of those people as you can attract, the better it will be for you and your station. A profitable demographic can mean that a station can have a smaller audience than another station in the same market, but can make more money. How can that possibly be? Well, the thing of it is that when your message is being targeted to the right audience, it becomes that much more valuable to somebody. The reason being is that you may have a higher percentage of the people that are listening in, be impacted by what it is you have to say and perhaps respond to it. For example, say that you have an education product that you're trying to sell, and you may find that you get more people that respond to the advertising of that product if you advertise the product on a station that features a lot of documentaries, if we're talking about television, as opposed to a station that focuses more on, say, comedy content or just a general content type of channel, because you have a greater percentage of people that are already into learning things. So they may be more interested in what you have as opposed to just the wide audience. And you may have more people that are interested in education watching that documentary channel than they are watching the general audience channel. So you've got a better chance of results in attracting more people overall, even though the pool of people that you're reaching may be smaller than just the population at large. Some methods of measuring audience. We're going to talk about some terms here. Rating services. These are companies that collect data about radio station listenership. The main one that we use in radio is called Nielsen. It used to be called Arbitron, but Nielsen acquired them several years ago. So they are the major player in audience measurement. They'll use a couple of different methods to measure what audiences are doing. Diaries are a more traditional form, especially in smaller radio markets. Basically, it's what you think it is. It's a book. It's a diary. People pull out the diary, they pull out a pen, and they write down what particular radio station they're listening to at a particular time. There's also what are called PPMs, portable people meters. These are devices that people wear that will actually listen to the signal of a station. There's some encoding that goes on that we can't hear with our ears that a station will transmit out, and these PPMs are able to pick up that information being sent out and automatically record what radio station a person is listening to at that time. Stations can be identified in diaries by their call letters, their frequency, or by their signature or slogan. So if someone is inputting information into a diary, what they may do if they're listening to, say, Mix 101.5 out of Raleigh, they might write down that they're listening to Mix 101.5. They might write down that they're listening to 101.5 FM. They might write down that they're listening to WRAL FM. They might write down the slogan of the station, the variety that makes you feel good. It's my wife's favorite station. That's how I know what that is. Anything that will identify that particular station, somebody may write down, and that would be a credit to the station that they are listening to. Geographic areas of audience measurement include two major ones here, the total survey area and the metro survey area. Total survey area usually includes several counties that are served by two or more stations from within a metropolitan area. So if we're talking about the Raleigh-Durham market, for example, that's going to include the counties in which those cities are included, and it's also going to include the surrounding counties. So in the case of Raleigh-Durham, it's basically going to cover a vast majority of central North Carolina. The metro survey area is a local area defined by the city and its immediate environs. So if we're talking again about the Raleigh-Durham market, basically we're talking about Wake County, Durham County, and Orange County, the counties in which Raleigh-Durham and Chapel Hill reside in. So metro survey area is smaller and compact and kind of focuses immediately around the particular metro itself, whereas the total survey area includes the entire metropolitan area and the more suburban and rural outskirts in which those stations can be picked up. A rating is a percentage of the total available audience. The way to think of this is that a rating is going to basically be a percentage of the number of listeners to a station relative to the total population of the station's market. Just throwing out numbers. Say you have a population of 1 million people in an area, and at that time, there's 100,000 people listening to a particular radio station. So that would be 10% of the population. 10% would be the rating that that station would receive as a score. Okay? The share is the percentage of people that are actually listening that actually use a radio on a regular basis. And this is usually shown as a percentage of listeners to a station relative to the number of people, again, that are actually listening to and using a radio. So same example. Say we have 1 million people within a market. You have 100,000 people listening to a particular radio station. So we've already discussed that the rating for that station would be 10%. However, let's say that out of the 1 million people that live in the area, only half of them, only 500,000 people, actually listen to radio. So now you have 100,000 people in an area out of 500,000 people that use radio that listen to the radio station. That means the share of audience for that particular radio station is 20%, because you're taking that ratio of 100,000 over 500,000 people that listen to radio, as opposed to 100,000 over 1 million people that are in the area. So that's the main difference between rating and share. Rating takes into account the total population of an area. Share takes into account the number of people that actually listen to radio. Some other terms for you, AQH persons. This is the number of listeners who have tuned in during a specific quarter hour. So we're talking about an actual physical block of time, from the top of the hour to 15 past the hour, or from 15 past to 30 past, and on around the clock. And people tune into a particular station for at least 5 minutes within that particular block of time. And a lot of surveyors will look at consecutive quarter hours to see how many people consistently listen through in those quarter hours. Cumulative audience measure. This is a big one in radio. We call it CUM for short. This determines the total number of people listening in terms of unduplicated audience listeners. So what this means is that a lot of different ratings numbers. You could listen at one point, say in the mornings on day 1, in the afternoons on day 2. Maybe you listen for an hour on day 3, but only 5 minutes on day 4. You could be counted in a lot of different statistics. What CUM tries to do is to say, okay, so you have listened to the radio station in this particular week. So you count as a stat. And they count the number of people that have done the same thing at some point during the week. If you've listened once, if you've listened 10 times, 20 times, you're counted as one person. So this will measure the number of people that have been impacted in some way by a radio station, which gives a better sense of the population that actually listens to a station on any sort of a regular basis. So that's what CUM tries to determine, the number of unique earlobes that listen to a station on some sort of a regular interval, I should say. And usually we tend to measure that in terms of weekly CUM, how many people per week listen to a particular station. Turnover ratio is a measure of how many people out of the entire audience leave the station during a given period. How many people get bored, turn off the station, or tune into another station? That's the turnover ratio. TSL, time spent listening, is a measure of the average time an individual listener tunes in to the station. So if you tune in and you stick around for 5 minutes or 15 minutes or an hour, we try to measure the average amount of time people are tuning in and sticking with the station. That can be important in order to determine things like how many times a person may be impacted by a message they hear in advertising. What sort of content attracts people to stay and listen to a particular program or some other kind of content. Now, some calculations here, and I'm going to show you these calculations. You don't necessarily need to freak out knowing how these formulas work, but they're presented here in an attempt to help you kind of understand how these things come together. One calculation is the gross impression. Gross impression is the total number of exposures to a commercial that a listener may experience. So basically what happens here is that they take the number of AQH persons. Again, that's the number of people that listen for at least 5 minutes during a particular 15-minute period. So they measure the AQH during the time that a commercial ran, and they multiply that by the total number of spots that aired on the station, and that gives gross impressions. That's the number of times that a commercial has impacted somebody that is listening. Now, this figure will reflect duplicated audience, meaning that the same person may hear the commercial a number of different times. Gross ratings point is simply a way of expressing gross impressions as a ratings figure. So they'll take the total number of spots aired in a quarter hour, multiply that by AQH ratings, and you get your gross ratings point. Just another way of talking about the same thing. The reach is a measurement of how many different listeners hear a particular commercial, and this number is calculated based on a station's cume. We're not going to get into the formula here, but basically it's the idea of the same thing as cume. You're trying to measure number of unique earlobes that listen to a station. With reach, you're trying to determine the number of unique earlobes that have heard a particular message. Frequency is the average number of times a theoretical listener hears a commercial. So they will take the gross impressions divided by the cume, and this will say that the average listener may hear a commercial whenever time it's aired, whatever day part, whatever, X number of times. And the higher the frequency, the more that someone is being impacted by that commercial. And there's different philosophies and formulas in terms of how many times a listener needs to hear a commercial before they actually kind of take in the message. Many times that number tends to be 3 in most sales circles. So a lot of times they're trying to determine how many times that commercial needs to be played over the air in order for a person to hear that commercial at least 3 times. So frequency is an important calculation in terms of trying to determine that figure. Paying for efficiency. A few more terms for you here. We're going to talk about the difference between cost per thousand and cost per point. Cost per thousand, the initials here are CPM, M being the Roman numeral for 1,000. CPM is simply the cost of reaching 1,000 listeners. So you see the formula there, how they determine that. The cost of all spots. So if you're paying $1,000, for example, for an advertising campaign, and then you're going to divide that number by gross impressions and divide again by 1,000. That is cost per thousand. So it may cost you $5 to reach 1,000 people. That's not a unrealistic cost per thousand number. Cost per point is a measure of how much it costs to buy one rating point in a particular market. And you see the formula there, cost of all spots divided by gross rating points. Now, the main difference here and why this matters to people is that if you're looking at cost per point, so in our example before, where we determined that a radio station may have a 10% rating, reaching 10% of the population of an area, the cost per point number is going to tell you how much it costs to reach 10% of the population of a particular market. And that may be more valuable in the mind of an advertiser if they're trying to give a particular message to a particular geographic area, and they are looking to impact as many people as they possibly can. So cost per point becomes a great number for them to use to determine effectiveness in how far their dollar is going in terms of impacting an audience. Optimum Effective Scheduling, OES. This is a mathematical formulation that determines the number of people who hear the spot 3 or more times and shows that figure as at least 50% of the total audience. A lot of wording there. Basically, again, it's that idea of trying to determine how many times a commercial needs to air in order for the average listener to hear that commercial at least 3 times, because smart people have determined that we need to hear a message at least 3 times in order for that message to impact us in some way. So with that in mind, feel free to listen to this lecture at least 3 times. Just kidding. You have your notes. You don't need to do that. Speaking of which, we're going to take a break on the notes, and we are going to continue with section 6 of your notes in the next video.